Out of nearly 3,000 people across the country who are currently doing alternative civilian service, fewer than 1% are in the republics of Buryatia and Bashkortostan. Yes, there is currently some administrative pressure during conscription. The laws are constantly changing, but this option still exists and people can still apply and get in. But it is civilian service, allowing individuals to remain safe and act accordance with their conscience.
The main focus of my research is a comparison between mortality rates in the region and war-related deaths in Ukraine. In the past, it was 1 person a day. Then it became 2. In 2024, we lost 3 people per day. By 2025, we were already seeing 6 to 7 deaths a day. And slowly, almost unnoticed, this accumulated to roughly 4,500 people.
We're hearing less and less about conscientious objection as a movement and about legal pathways. Instead, the focus is increasingly on desertion, on what to do afterwards, how to get a lighter sentence, and how to avoid being forcibly sent back to the front line. Because this is also part of the Russian army's strategy, it's often easier to return a person to the combat zone than to formally press charges against him and take them to court.
As for access to alternative civilian service, the numbers are very low. According to my data, this is partly due to lack of awareness and partly because there is no one left to work on it. We have a very small number of lawyers still actively supporting conscripts. They are constantly warning that their colleagues have left this field, partly due to direct threats from military draft office staff. As a result, the proportion of conscientious objectors remains extremely low.
Hello everyone, you're listening to the podcast of the Anti-Discrimination Centre Memorial, dedicated to the rights of Indigenous peoples. Today we have what is probably our most difficult topic yet. We will be talking about militarization and about how Russia's war in Ukraine has affected the lives of Indigenous peoples in Russia and the protection, or rather the violation, of their rights. If this topic resonates with you or you simply find it interesting, please like and subscribe. I would like to introduce today's guests on a podcast we are hosting together with Stefania Kulaeva. With us today is Valentina Bazarova, an analyst at the Free Buryatia Foundation. Hello, Valentina.
Hello.
Artyom Kliga, head of the legal department of the Conscientious Objectors Movement.
Good evening. Hello.
Ruslan Valiev, journalist and publisher of the media outlet Aspects of Bashkortostan.
Hello, colleagues.
And Sergey Krivenko, an expert with the human rights group Citizen Army Law. Hello, Sergey.
Hello.
And as I already said, Stefania Kulaeva, an expert at the Anti-Discrimination Centre Memorial. Stefania, would you like to begin?
Hello. We have decided to dedicate this episode of Anti-Discrimination Podcast to a difficult conversation about how the war is affecting the lives of indigenous peoples living in Russian Federation and how Russian authorities and security services are forcing members of those communities to take part in the war against Ukraine. Undoubtedly, all those who in one way or another have supported the war, taken part in it, or carried out criminal orders from criminal authorities bear responsibility. At the same time, activists and human rights defenders within indigenous movements strongly condemn this aggression, and they also condemn the participation of those who, willingly or not, have taken part in the fighting. But there is also another reality, the lives of people in their own regions, where this war has arrived in the form of mobilization and through attempts to force people to sign contracts by various means. This includes very young people, 18 years old, and in some cases, there are reports of people being coerced, even through torture, into signing contracts. There are also those who made such decisions for different reasons, perhaps without fully understanding the situation, but who have since realized they are not prepared to take part in the war and want to find out a way to leave it, cancel their contract, avoid mobilization, or even desert. That's why we believe it's important to talk about the options that exist, how people can refuse the service, how they can avoid it, and how they can leave even once they are already in the army. This is particularly important for indigenous communities, who often see themselves as victims of this war and are wider partners of state violence, including imperial policy, colonial practices, discrimination. And for that reason, it's especially important to help to protect people from being drawn into participation in the crimes of Russian state.
To begin with, let us hear from shore activist Vladislav Tanagashev, who has clearly outlined the situation of indigenous peoples in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. Without absolving those who voluntarily went to fight in what he describes as a criminal war in Ukraine of their responsibility, he reminded us that there are also those who have made efforts to avoid being sent to the front. Today, in particular, we are talking about how to support those people.
Indigenous peoples who come onto Ukrainian territory are aggressors, and Ukraine is fully within its rights to defend its land and to fight against them. There is a war going on, and in that sense, this is the position that must be taken. But overall, for indigenous peoples, this is a catastrophic situation because they are small in number. And responsibility for this lies entirely with the Russian authorities and with the population of the Russian Federation itself. And it also cannot be shifted away from those individuals who chose to take up arms and go to a foreign land. Why do I take this position? Because there is always a way out. When people say, I had no way out, so I went and started killing because I didn't know any other option, I don't accept that. I know of many cases where young people from indigenous communities have fled abroad. They left everything behind. Some went to Kazakhstan, others to Norway. I know of several Sami people who left everything and went to Norway and are now waiting for decisions from the Norwegian authorities. There are also young men from the shore people who had already been mobilized but refused to fight. And according to reports, some of them were killed as a result. In other cases, people simply went into the forest and hid there while mobilization was taking place. And there are also cases where those who refused to go were sent to prison.
This is a very broad issue, and I suggest we begin with the question of rights violations affecting people already serving in the armed forces. In particular, members of indigenous communities. Perhaps, Sergey, since you have worked for some time on the relationship between the individual and the military, between citizens and the army, you could start?
At the moment, it is extremely difficult to speak about violations within the armed forces because in wartime there is a continuous flow of such reports. These violations can be grouped into several categories. First, those taking part in the war in Ukraine include both contract soldiers and mainly conscripts. In practice, many are not allowed to leave the armed forces. That in itself raises serious questions about constitutional rights. Second, there is extensive reporting on pressure and abuse faced by soldiers who try to end their contracts, refuse to serve, or withdraw from participation in the war. These accounts continue to emerge regularly. And third, conscripts are in some cases being pressured into signing contracts. In certain situations, this pressure can amount to coercion. That said, it is difficult to identify any specific pattern targeting indigenous peoples or particular ethnic groups. There is no clear evidence of ethnically targeted treatment.
I would now like to turn to representatives of organizations working specifically with indigenous peoples. We have Valentina from Buryatia and Ruslan from Bashkortostan with us. Perhaps you could share what you know about the situation, or those who have been mobilized in Buryatia, for example?
I do not see clear differences based on ethnicity, as the previous speaker suggested. What we are seeing instead are regional disparities, though these are not necessarily linked to ethnicity or even directly to poverty. Some regions are poorer than Buryatia, yet Buryatia has seen a particularly high proportion of people sent to the war. We do not yet have a clear explanation for why this is the case. One suggestion is that local officials may be trying to demonstrate loyalty to the Kremlin. The head of the republic, for example, is widely regarded as a Kremlin appointee who came to power under Putin, has no real personal ties to the region, and is now under pressure to show results. During mobilization, he appeared keen to exceed quotas, unlike some other regional leaders who at least tried to limit the impact on their populations. In Buryatia, by contrast, the approach was seen as pushing to send as many people as possible. Similar dynamics may also apply to contract recruitment, where local authorities are incentivized to meet or exceed targets.
This isn't related to the fact that there's simply no work in the region?
Buryatia is not among the poorest regions in Russia. There are others that are significantly worse off, such as Kursk and Kemerovo regions. Of course, overall, living standards in Russia are low, and many people are under severe economic pressure. But this alone does not fully explain the scale of mobilization from the Republic. Ultimately, recruitment decisions are made and implemented locally. How many people are sent, how actively recruitment is pursued, how conscription is enforced. In some places, recruitment messaging is visible everywhere, in transport, schools, and public spaces. At the same time, I do not believe there is a national or ethnic dimension to this or evidence of any targeted policy against smaller indigenous peoples. Rather, it appears to be the result of several overlapping factors: regional disadvantage, local governance problems. Together, these have contributed to disproportionately high numbers being sent to the war. However, it should also be noted that there are significant casualties from other regions as well, including Krasnoyarsk Krai and Sverdlovsk Oblast, areas that are not national republics.
We know that the highest number of casualties come from the Republic of Bashkortostan. Ruslan, I'd like to ask you how this looks from your perspective in the Urals.
On the issue of local authorities' role, I would fully agree. We see a very similar pattern here as well. Much like in Buryatia, the regional leadership is often seen as closely aligned with Moscow and keen to demonstrate loyalty to the center, partly because its position is not always politically secure. But I think the picture is more complex. Paradoxically, Bashkortostan, while leading in terms of casualties, is not among the poorest regions economically. It is, in fact, a relatively developed republic with a population of around 4 million. I am not convinced by the idea that there is any deliberate policy aimed at sending non-Russian populations to war. I was trying to recall whether any senior officials ever suggested something along those lines, that non-Russians might be easier to send into combat because they are somehow more distant from Ukrainians. That idea has been mentioned in public discourse before, and it could be discussed separately. But I do not believe there are any official instructions to recruit more Bashkirs, Tatars, or others. And yet, in practice, this is how things appear. If we look at the breakdown of casualties by ethnicity, we do not see a clear predominance of Bashkirs or Tatars compared to Russians. In some of our reporting, lists of the dead from certain districts contain only Russian surnames, simply because those areas are predominantly Russian-speaking. What we do see more clearly is a regional and socio-economic pattern, particularly linked to rural employment traditions in Bashkortostan. A significant proportion of the rural population has historically worked in rotational or shift-based employment. This has long been a structural feature of the regional economy. In many cases, people have effectively moved from one form of shift work to another, from civilian labor to military service, which from their perspective can appear similar except for the pay. There is also a clear geographical dimension. The higher casualty figures tend to come from more remote districts, particularly in the trans-Ural areas. These are regions with a higher concentration of Bashkir population, which partly explains the demographic profile of the losses.
So, in practical terms, a large number of Bashkirs are expected to be among the dead.
I wouldn't say it is significantly higher. We do have data specifically from Ufa, the capital. There you see more Russian surnames among the casualties, reflecting the mixed and highly heterogeneous nature of the city and its surrounding districts. Some nearby rural areas are predominantly Russian-speaking, and their casualty rates per capita are broadly comparable to those in rural trans-Ural districts. So across the Republic, there is a kind of average pattern, but it masks significant local variation. If you look at Ufa and its surroundings, it can resemble a more typical Central Russian region, but if you look at areas such as Beymak or Sibay, the picture changes significantly, and it becomes much more clearly a national republic in demographic terms. Ultimately, what we are left with is a combined picture. There are around 9,000 officially confirmed casualties, and our estimates suggest approximately 60,000 to 70,000 people have been mobilized or conscripted.
I would also like to add that our region is home not only to Buryats, but also to other indigenous peoples such as the Evenks, the Soyots, and others. In many cases, statistics on the number of Buryats, Russians, and Soyots are not very reliable because it is often difficult to distinguish between them. Surnames are largely the same, and for example, there are very few Soyots left. For them in particular, the losses may only become clear after the war when more accurate data becomes available. And for these communities, the impact will likely be extremely severe.
We are mainly talking about conscription at the moment, but is there any information from the front itself? Is there any indication that members of indigenous peoples are exposed to greater risks?
There are so-called ethnic battalions, relatively small units. According to some reports, they have already gone through several rotations of personnel. On that basis, some conclude that these battalions function effectively as elite assault units used as frontline cannon fodder with extremely high turnover. As a result, what we are seeing is that the ethnic battalions first formed in the autumn of 2022 may, in practice, no longer exist in their original composition.
How can we help people who are being called up for military service and do not want to serve, those who have not yet been conscripted but are already at risk? Perhaps Artyom can comment.
Yes, what we are seeing now is that compulsory military service has effectively become a mechanism through which the authorities are recruiting people for the war. Conscription today is extremely dangerous. In 2022, there was still some debate about whether conscripts were being deployed or not, but now it appears that the Russian authorities have, for the first time since 1991, begun to fundamentally change their approach to conscripts. Previously, there was a widely held assumption that young conscripts should not be sent into combat, shaped by the traumatic legacy of Afghanistan, the Chechen wars, and the emergence of soldiers' mothers movements, which arose in response to conscript casualties in those conflicts. But that assumption, it seems, is now breaking down. In 2022, that norm still largely held, and there were even public reports of officers being punished for deploying conscripts. However, developments following the fighting in the Kursk region in 2025 suggest that this has now become state practice. As I see it, there are essentially two ways to avoid it. The first is exemption on medical grounds. The list of conditions remains relatively broad, although in 2025 the authorities have attempted to narrow it, removing certain diagnoses or making them eligible for service. Still, it remains significant. The second option is alternative civilian service. It's now reported that the State Duma plans to introduce amendments that would automatically suspend conscription board decisions for those appealing their rulings. These may seem like minor procedural changes, but they reflect a clear trend. People are left with fewer and fewer legal means to challenge conscription decisions or protect themselves from being drafted. This is why alternative civilian service is becoming increasingly popular. It was already gaining traction during the war, and according to available data, more than 3,000 people are now serving in alternative roles, an all-time record since 2012 when systematic records began. This increase is not necessarily because demand was previously low, but because the reliable statistics only began in 2012. As legal options narrow, this route is likely to be recommended more often, because even if someone is accepted into alternative civilian service, it effectively provides protection from conscription and from the risk of being sent to the front. Even then, applicants may still appeal decisions, sometimes multiple times, and reapply for alternative service, maintaining a legal distance from military conscription. These are, in a sense, the main mechanisms currently available. Although, of course, there is always the possibility that the Defense Ministry's political lobby may introduce further changes, it's unlikely that alternative civilian service can be fully abolished as it's guaranteed under the Constitution.
I want to emphasize once again that everything Artem said is absolutely correct. Alternative civilian service remains one of the strongest options for those who do not wish to join the military or take part in the war. And so importantly, it is still somewhat surprisingly a genuine form of civilian service. People carry it out in the civilian sector, in social services and other organizations. However, Rostrud statistics show that uptake remains extremely low. Out of more than 3,000 people undertaking alternative service across the country, in the republics of Buryatia and Bashkortostan, the figure is less than 1%. In other words, very few people choose to apply. This may be a matter of awareness and outreach.
Or simply a lack of information.
It is still possible to apply for alternative civilian service. Yes, there is administrative pressure during conscription and legislation is constantly changing, but the option remains in place. People do undertake alternative service, sometimes even living at home and simply going to work on a normal 8-hour schedule. The term is longer, around 21 months instead of 1 year, but it is civilian service, allowing individuals to remain safe and act accordance with their conscience.
I think it's very important that this information is communicated more widely. I'm sure that in many places, people simply do not know that this is even an option, let alone how to access it. Before asking Valentina why this is so rarely used, for example, in Buryatia, I would like to add one more point. Even if the proportion of indigenous peoples among the dead doesn't exceed their share of the population, in absolute terms, this is a catastrophe for small nations. These communities are very small in number. The Buryat people, for example, are not large in population. Also deeply saddened to hear about the death of 18-year-old soldiers who, I understand, were deployed only briefly. They were from the Tofalar people of the Irkutsk region, not far from Buryatia, a community that numbers only a few hundred people, around 600 before the war. This is a closed, isolated community living in the Tsayan mountains. Young men are transported from the place where they live by helicopter for compulsory military service. There is a specific case in which a young man was conscripted in early August, and by 1st September his family had received a notice of death. In effect, he was placed in a situation where, it appears, he was pressured into signing a contract almost immediately after finishing school. For people such as Tofalars, the loss of even a few young men who have not yet started the families, effectively moving straight from school into combat, represents a devastating blow. It's the loss of language, culture, and the future of entire people. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask Valentina, what is the situation with alternative civilian service in Buryatia?
At present, it is precisely those who have completed conscription who are being actively recruited, heavily encouraged, and in some cases, I believe, coerced. I have heard reports of signatures being forged on contracts. Some young men have attempted to challenge this legally in military courts. There is a clear trend of increasingly young casualties from 18 and 19-year-olds, and often those who are sent to the front after only a month of service. The central point of my research is a comparison of regional mortality causes with war-related deaths in Ukraine. What once seemed like a drop in the ocean has turned out to be far more significant. Around 4,500 people from the Republic have died over the past 4 years. It began with 1 death a day, then 2. In 2024, it reached 3 a day, and by 2025, it was 6 to 7 deaths a day. Gradually and almost unnoticed, the total has accumulated to around 4,500. But when we compare this with overall mortality in the Republic, fewer people are dying from cancer, road traffic accidents, and other injuries than from the war. In my assessment, the total number of working-age men who die from cancer, accidents, injuries, and cardiovascular disease is now lower than the number killed in the war. In 2025 alone, 1,705 men died. That is a staggering figure. Diseases that's traditionally accounted for the highest mortality among working-age men have now been overtaken by war-related deaths by a significant margin.
In other words, the working-age male population over there is being exterminated, as a matter of fact.
Yes, these are potential fathers who could have raised children. We estimate that around 2,300 children were not born during this period, because when 18 and 19 and 22-year-old men die, the demographic impact is profound.
First and foremost, Russian aggression is destroying Ukraine's population. And this is reflected not only in the loss of lives, but also in the number of unborn children, including the potential children of military personnel. But we can also see that other peoples are being affected. We are hearing growing objections from a number of countries whose citizens are taking part in the war. Countries in Central Asia and Africa, as well as republics within Russia itself. And of course, there are indigenous population who, like the Tofalars, are already on the brink of disappearance, and not yet on the brink, but potentially pushed towards it if the war continues and takes their lives. It was important for me to hear about the rising death toll. When it is presented as abstract figures, it's one thing, but when you see the number of deaths per day in a specific republic, Far from Ukraine, in the Far East, it becomes something entirely different. Far more people were dying in 2025 than in previous years, and I fear that 2026 will be no better. So, is there any advice for those who are already in the army? Perhaps Artyom or Sergey, for those who have been mobilized or ended up there in other circumstances and do not wish to take part in the war? What options do they have apart from prison or death?
In practice, prison still has to be earned. There is a category of Russian servicemen who refuse to take part in combat operations and submit formal refusals or reports. They face criminal prosecution because such refusal has been criminalized. In September 2022, criminal liability was introduced for refusing to take part in hostilities. Then, as difficult as it may sound, prison is often becoming one of the only available outcomes for these servicemen. There are different scenarios. If a refusal takes place at the front line, sentences can reach 10 to 12 years. If it is submitted away from the front on Russian, it may result in 2 to 3 years in prison. And there are now more than 1,000 such cases at minimum estimates based on criminal proceedings under relevant articles. More than 1,000 people have chosen imprisonment over continuing participation in the war. And this refers specifically to serving military personnel. If we are not talking about servicemen, we are living under the continued risk of mobilization. So when there is speculation about a possible second wave. In that context, alternative civilian service is also sometimes seen as an option.
I thought the right to alternative service did not apply in cases of mobilization, only to conscription. Or am I mistaken?
Formally, there is no separate law governing alternative civilian service during mobilization. There is no procedural framework that allows someone mobilized to be redirected into such service. However, the constitutional right itself remains in place. During the first mobilization, according to estimates, several hundred, possibly even thousands of people refused mobilization on these grounds and did not join the armed forces. In many cases, they were not prosecuted precisely because there is no specific legal mechanism or criminal penalty attached to that refusal. It is therefore a way of refusing mobilization on the basis of conscience, although it requires following specific procedures outlined by human rights organizations. In short, alternative civilian service is often described as a kind of safety valve. For conscription, it is a formal route. If someone does not wish to serve, they can apply for it. In the event of mobilization, individuals can still attempt to assert their rights on constitutional grounds. The situation is complex, but it remains in principle possible. When it comes to contract recruitment, individuals are advised to resist pressure and not to sign. Legal challenges, complaints to prosecutors, and support from family members can sometimes, and in some cases often, make a difference. And in any case, a military contract is legally voluntary. It should not be signed under coercion. So there are ways of resisting.
There are reports of people being recruited into the army through deception, simply being made to sign contracts they have never properly seen. Is that true?
Yes, it is. This particularly affects people under strong state pressure. First and foremost, conscripts, those already serving their mandatory one-year term. If they do not sign a contract, they are discharged after their service period. But if they do sign, it can become a trap. They effectively remain in the military with no real possibility of leaving and a very high risk, estimated at around 90%, of being deployed to the front. The second category includes migrants and newly naturalized citizens, particularly those from Central Asian countries. Language barriers and lack of understanding of the legal system are often exploited. Pressure is applied, including through raids and intimidation. In some cases, individuals are told that if they do not sign a contract, their families will be deported. As a result, tens of thousands of migrants are reportedly pressured into signing contracts each year through coercion or deception. And then there are prisoners and detainees who are also in vulnerable positions and face similar pressure to sign contracts. As for those outside these categories, one might say that participation is more likely to be voluntary.
I'd also like to ask Artyom to explain. In your view, are there any ways forward, any advice we can give to people who have ended up in the army? If they are unable to withstand the pressure, have signed a contract, or have otherwise realized they are not prepared to take part in the war and carry out unlawful orders, Is there any way out?
First and foremost, it's essential to assess one's risks very carefully. The people in combat zones belong to very different categories of military personnel. Some may be serving in assault units, where their main objective is simply to get out of that environment, at least back onto Russian territory. There can be various reasons for this: injury or attempts to secure transfer. I know of cases where individuals have paid bribes to be transferred into evacuation units or assigned to support roles in military investigative departments, such as delivering documents. In other words, the options are highly situational. The first question is whether it's safe at all to file complaints or submit reports, or whether doing so might put a person in even greater danger. If there is even a minimal chance of reaching Russian territory, the next step often becomes the decision to desert. This is of course illegal. We know that around 85% of deserters go deeper into Russia rather than abroad. There is no question of people fleeing into Europe, Armenia or Kazakhstan in most cases. The majority simply go into hiding with Russia. At that point, it becomes extremely important to begin challenging their legal status, seeking legal representation and consulting human rights organizations about possible courses of action. Once a person has deserted, a criminal case will most likely be opened against them for abandoning the military unit. As human rights lawyers advise, it's important to document the period of absence, as this may affect the outcome of the case. And if a person is already inside Russia, some lawyers argue it may be preferable to serve a prison sentence than to remain in the war. In this sense, prison is seen, however harshly, as a way of preserving one's life. If a person decides to leave Russia, it's important to understand that there are no systematic support structures in Europe or elsewhere specifically for Russian deserters. Life in countries such as Armenia is often difficult, but it can allow people to work and gradually regularize their status. I've spoken to more than 100 deserters in Armenia. Some have managed to find relatively stable work in construction, for example, becoming site managers or foremen, earning a living and waiting out the situation. It's not easy, but many see it as preferable to being sent to the front. As for legal routes, families often ask about them, and to be honest, I can barely name even a handful of cases in which a military medical commission has granted discharge in such circumstances. These are extremely rare, usually limited to severe illness or serious injury. In my view, this reflects a broader political directive, so it's very difficult to speak about reliable legal pathways. Sometimes there are short windows, for example, when someone signs a contract and quickly realizes what has happened and seeks to challenge it in court. That is why increasingly discussion shifts away from legal mechanisms towards what happens after desertion, how to reduce a sentence and how to avoid being forcibly returned to the front, which is often the military's preferred outcome, as it's easier than pursuing legal proceedings.
I also wanted to ask, religious grounds are sometimes cited for refusing service. We know of cases involving Christian believers. But in the regions where indigenous populations are more likely to be Muslim or Buddhist, is it possible to rely on religious conviction as a basis for refusal?
The reality is that there is very limited protection. In Buryatia, the head of the Russian Buddhist Sangha, Khambo Lama Ayusheyev, has expressed support for the war. He has described President Putin in highly reverential terms and has also encouraged clergy and students at Buddhist universities to take part in the war. There have already been casualties among such students, at least 2 or 3 confirmed cases, so there is effectively no institutional religious protection available. However, in practice, the situation is more complicated. Even the 14th Dalai Lama has not spoken out directly against the war, limiting himself to general calls for peace. Had he taken a clearer stance, it is possible that some Buddhists in Buryatia might have been influenced by it. Instead, within parts of the Buddhist community, the war is interpreted very differently, in some cases even framed in religious terms. When I read public memorial pages, I often see Buddhist prayers in the comments with people wishing the deceased a good rebirth. In that sense, the war is not necessarily seen as contradicting religious doctrine.
In Bashkortostan, a similar situation is unfolding. The former leader of Russia's Muslims, the Grand Mufti Talgat Tajudin, is based in Ufa. From the very first days, he pledged loyalty and has been consistently giving sermons day and night, describing what he calls a holy war in highly positive terms. As a result, there is little or no protection for those who might wish to object on religious grounds. We have already discussed alternative civilian service, but participation remains extremely low. In my view, this is due both to lack of awareness and to the absence of sufficient legal support infrastructure. There are very few lawyers still working actively on conscription and military cases. Many, as I know from colleagues, have come under pressure, including direct threats from military recruitment offices. This appears to reflect a broader policy environment. As a result, the proportion of conscientious objectors remains very small.
On international solidarity, there is a perception that Buryats, for example, were able to find support in Mongolia during mobilization.
As for broader solidarity, Teftos, there is a belief that Muslim communities might find refuge in countries such as Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan did initially accept people. I went through that experience myself, and there was genuine sympathy at a personal level. But at a state level, support was limited. The same applies to Turkey. Many people went there expecting solidarity, stayed for several months, and ultimately returned to Ufa.
Similarly, Mongolia initially showed openness, but political pressure later shifted the situation and support diminished. Today, those who are there tend to remain silent.
It is very sad to realize that indigenous peoples have nowhere to turn. They're seen as not quite one of us in chauvinistic Russia, used in an aggressive war, and yet they cannot turn to the international community for support.
The human rights organizations do continue to provide assistance. There are helplines staffed by lawyers, and anyone facing conscription, alternative service issues, or seeking to leave the military can contact them. We try to support people as far as possible, including legal assistance in Russian courts. Details of these organizations will be provided below.
We will include them in the podcast description. That brings us to the end of our discussion. Our next episode will focus on indigenous people who, as a result of repression, many Russians are now in this situation, but for indigenous peoples, whose connection to their land is particularly strong, this separation can be especially painful, have found themselves outside Russia. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. And thank you to all our guests for their contributions and expertise. This has been a podcast from the Anti-Discrimination Centre Memorial, Brussels. Goodbye, and until next time.